In April 1999, a body surfaced in the St. Lawrence Seaway near a Hells Angels clubhouse outside Quebec City. It was bound, mutilated, and wrapped in plastic, but the duct tape was still holding it together. From the condition of it, the body had been in the water a long time. When investigators finally identified the remains, they were not looking at a stranger. They were looking at a man they had been hunting for the past 18 months. A man who was on watch lists across the province, and authorities believed he had gone underground to escape them, but he had not gone anywhere. He was identified as Scott Steinert, and Steinert was no ordinary criminal. He was the executioner of the biker war that was tearing Quebec apart. The man who took his orders directly from Mom Boucher, the most feared crime boss in the country. That man was supposed to be untouchable. He had survived the police, the courts, and every rival who came for him. But his body surfacing near one of the club's own clubhouses meant none of those enemies had been the one to end him. The call had come from inside. This is the story of why the Hells Angels turned on the most dangerous man they had. The answer starts with a problem the Hells Angels never solved about Scott Steinert. He was never really one of them. He was an American who showed up in Quebec as a kid speaking the wrong language and clawed his way to the top of the most violent criminal organization in the country without ever shaking the sense, among the men around him, that he did not belong. That resentment never went away. In the end, it helped get him killed. Steinert was born in Wisconsin in 1962 and moved to Quebec with his family at the age of 8. Almost nothing is recorded about his early years. He surfaces in the early 1990s, already inside the Montreal Hells Angels, already feared and already rich, running 3 stripper agencies and an escort service that fed straight into the club's economy. It gave him what most strikers never had: his own money and his own men before he ever earned a patch. Most of what Steinert did in these years would have stayed buried, except one of the men closest to that world was secretly working for the police. In 1994, a Hells Angels associate named Danny Kane began informing the RCMP, and his reports kept circling back to one name. Kane called Steinert the most aggressive of all the Angels. He told his handlers the American was buying stolen dynamite, and that he already had roughly 10 C4 devices planted around Montreal. But these were not careful bombs. The detonators were so unstable they sometimes went off on their own, and only luck kept ordinary people out of the blast. Kane had seen plenty of violent men. What set Steinert apart was the focus. According to his reports, Steinert woke up every morning and planned his entire day around a single question: how to put the Hells Angels on top of the rock machine. That was the war that defined everything. By 1994, Quebec had collapsed into open conflict between the Hells Angels and the rock machine, a fight over Montreal's drug trade that would kill more than 160 people before it ended. And Kane's reports put Steinert at the center of it. In November 1994, his handler wrote down the chain of command in one line. Mom Boucher hands out the execution orders. Steinert is the executioner. Boucher was the most feared crime boss in Canada and the leader of the Hells Angels War, and his executioner was a man even the RCMP struggled to describe without flinching, calling him in one report a violent and cruel psychopath who could not control himself. But the work itself was anything but uncontrolled. Steinert once paid a pilot to fly him over Montreal so he could buy the aerial photos and plan assassinations from above. His reach ran past Quebec into Buffalo and New York City, where a member of the Bonanno crime family had him supply dancers to a club in the Dominican Republic, and by the mid-1990s, a huge share of the strippers working Niagara Falls and New York traced back to his agencies. By the end of 1994, Boucher pulled Steinert into a meeting of the club's top members to map out the destruction of the rock machine's leadership. At the top of the plan, next to the most important targets, was the name of the man who would pull the trigger: Scott Steinert. 8 months later, that plan met a summer morning in Montreal and produced the single act that changed organized crime in Canada forever. By the summer of 1995, The war had turned Montreal into what bikers across North America called the Red Zone, a city where bombs had become the weapon of choice, and ordinary residents were living next to a conflict they barely understood. The hatred behind it ran deeper than territory. Maurice Boucher and Salvatore Cazzetta had once been brothers in the same small gang, and when it broke apart, the two men chose opposite sides of a line. Cazzetta would never join the Hells Angels because he refused to forgive the club for murdering 5 of its own members at Lennoxville. Boucher looked at the same massacre and took the patch anyway. So Cazzetta built the rock machine instead, and a decade later, the two former friends were wiring bombs into each other's cars over Montreal's drug corners, each one knowing exactly how the other thought. On the morning of August 9th, 1995, a Jeep sat parked on a street in Montreal's East End. It belonged to Marc Dubé, a 26-year-old low-level dealer on the Hells Angels side of the war, and someone had wired it with a remote-controlled bomb. When it went off, it killed Dubé instantly, but Dubé was not the only victim. Across the street, in a schoolyard, the shrapnel found an 11-year-old boy named Daniel Desrochers playing on an ordinary August day. He did not survive. The death of Daniel Desrochers broke something in Quebec. The war had been killing criminals for over a year, and the public had looked away, but a child in a schoolyard ended that. The next morning, the newspapers put the boy's face on every front page. Tens of thousands demanded action, and the government scrambled to answer. What the public did not know was what the informer was telling his handlers. According to Danny Kane, the bombing was never a rock machine attack. Kane reported that Boucher and Steinert had planned to kill one of their own people in a brutal public way to turn the city against the rock machine, and that Marc Dubé, a man on their own side, was the one chosen to die. No one was ever charged with the bombing, and the claim was never tested in court. But the RCMP reached its own conclusion. Their report named Steinert as the man most likely to have detonated the device, and noted he would have done it knowing there were children playing across the street. The fallout never stopped. A month later, a full patch member was shot dead getting into his car at a shopping mall, and 9 bombs went off around the province during his funeral. In response, the government created Carcajou, a joint squad of the RCMP, provincial, and Montreal police with one mandate: destroy the biker gangs. The boy's death pushed further still, becoming one of the forces behind Canada's first federal anti-gang law. And if Kane's account was true, then the pressure that would eventually consume everyone in this story was set off by the club's own executioner. Inside the Hells Angels, none of it slowed Steinert down. The 2 years after the bombing were the best of his criminal life, and they began with a patch only killers are allowed to wear. In March 1996, Scott Steinert got everything he had worked for in a single night. He received his full Hells Angels patch, the membership he had chased for years as an American outsider, and sewn onto that brand new vest was a second patch, Filthy Few. Inside the club, that patch carries one meaning, reserved for members who have killed for the Hells Angels. It was the proudest night of his life, and the second patch meant more to him than the first. 5 months later, the club handed him an army. On August 30th, 1996, Michael LaJoie Smith, the Hells Angel who ran the Death Riders, pleaded guilty to plotting a strip club bombing and to a beating that left a man in a wheelchair for life, and went to prison for both. Steinert replaced him. The Death Riders were the club's puppet gang in Laval, and the role put the drug trade across Laval and the Lower Laurentians under one man. Then came the House. In 1996, Steinert paid around $600,000 for one of the most famous properties in Quebec, the Lavigueur Mansion on Île aux Pruches, a small island in the river off Laval. The Lavigueur were the province's most famous lottery family. They had won a fortune in 1986 and used it to build an enormous estate, by one account a mansion with 17 bedrooms, and the property became a symbol across Quebec of overnight wealth. A decade later, that house belonged to the most feared enforcer in the Hells Angels. He turned it into a fortress. He raised an 8-foot fence, studded the grounds with cameras, and moved his bodyguard, Donald Magnuson, into one of the buildings as a permanent shadow on the property. Police wiretaps from the period caught rivals discussing the bunker Steinert was building on the island. Fortifications serious enough that investigators believed a strike on the compound was being planned. The estate became his headquarters, where Hell's Angels and Death Riders came to do business with the Godfather on his island. It also became a film set. Steinert directed and starred in graphic films shot on the property, and the most famous of them, a production called Babe's Angel, became a genuine hit in the Canadian adult industry. A full-patch Hell's Angel, the alleged executioner of the biker war, was moonlighting as a director in a lottery family's mansion. There has never been another figure quite like him in Canadian crime. And at the height of it, Steinert made his most audacious move. He built his own faction inside the Hell's Angels, a crew that other members mockingly called the Group of Five, charging $100,000 to anyone who wanted in. But this was not a crew for running drugs or settling scores with the rock machine. Steinert built it to challenge the most powerful unit in the entire club, the Nomads. The elite inner circle Mom Boucher had handpicked from the best members of every chapter the year before. It was like Steinert was building an army to rival his own leadership. But the patch, the army, the island, the crew, all of it was being watched, not by the police, by his own brothers. And the men watching Scott Steinert rise were the most dangerous in the club. The enemies inside the Nomads were the aristocracy of the Hell's Angels, and two of their heaviest members had a problem with the American. Walter Stadnick, known as Nurget, was the strategist quietly building the club's national empire across Ontario and into Manitoba. David Carroll, known as Wolf, was a founding nomad and one of the most influential members in the country. By the middle of 1996, the Quebec Hell's Angels had split into two camps, one loyal to Steinert, and a second, stronger one behind Stadnick and Carroll. The fight was over the future. Ontario was the biggest prize in Canadian organized crime, an untapped territory the club intended to conquer, and Steinert wanted to lead that expansion himself. The factions clashed constantly over money and over who would run Ontario, and there was something darker underneath it, the names of rival nomads sitting on lists in Steinert's world, with Wolf Carroll's at the top. A Canadian criminologist would later describe Steinert as an ambitious psychopath and the most dangerous man in the Hell's Angels. Caught directly between the two camps was Danny Kane. He worked for Carroll while Steinert tried to control him, and in March 1995, the two Angels nearly came to blows over something as small as whether Kane could drive Carroll to Halifax. His reports from this period read like dispatches from inside a slow-motion civil war. The most powerful criminal organization in Canada was fighting the rock machine on the outside and quietly tearing at itself on the inside. And Kane was nearly exposed twice. Once by his own slip, when he told his handlers about a beating he had witnessed, and the attacker later realized only a handful of people could have leaked it. The second time came from a corrupt Montreal detective who kept pressing Kane's handler to reveal the identity of informer C2994. He pushed so hard that the handler suspected the detective was working for the Hells Angels, and he was right. The detective was later arrested for taking bribes. The club was hunting its rat with muscle and with bought cops, and it still could not find him. So the suspicion kept drifting toward the man who fit the club's fears, the outsider, the American whose rise had been too fast and whose luck had been too good. Then the government attacked from a third direction. Steinert had lived in Canada since he was 8, but he had never become a citizen, and in 1996, the federal authorities moved to deport him. His answer was a lawyer's masterpiece. In December 1996, he married a Canadian woman and had a child with her, and his legal team argued that Canada could not take a Canadian child's father away. The deportation stalled in the courts, and even the government could not touch him. So look at Scott Steinert in the middle of 1997. He had survived the police, who could not charge him for the bombing. He had survived the state, which could not deport him. He had even survived the rock machine, who burned his escort agency to the ground and accomplished nothing. Every enemy outside the club had taken its shot and missed. But the threat forming inside the club was one no lawyer could stall and no fence could keep out. Police raids kept landing too precisely, which meant information was leaking, and the Hells Angels began hunting for a rat. Suspicion among the men around Stadnick and Carroll settled on the outsider, whose rise had been too fast and whose luck had been too good. And they became convinced Scott Steinert was the informer. But Steinert was not the traitor. The real informer was Danny Kane, and by the autumn of 1997, the only question left was one nobody inside the club would say out loud. Not whether something would happen to Scott Steinert. The final piece of the story is the man standing next to Steinert that night. His bodyguard, Donald Magnuson, had made enemies of his own, and those enemies may have helped get them both killed. Magnuson was a Thunder Bay heavyweight known as Bam Bam, Steinert's bodyguard, housemate, and closest ally. But on May 14, 1996, at a Hells Angels party hosted by the Halifax chapter, Magnuson got into a fight with a guest named David Boyko and killed him. Boyko was not an ordinary man. He was the boss of the Los Brovos, the most powerful motorcycle club in Winnipeg, and the Hells Angels had been carefully courting that club to anchor their expansion into Manitoba. That expansion was Walter Stadnick's personal project, built over years of patient diplomacy, and Magnuson had blown it apart at a single party. The killing poisoned the Winnipeg deal for years, and it was not his only damage, because Magnuson had also beaten the son of Montreal Mafia boss Vito Rizzuto, enraging the most powerful crime family in Canada and one of the Hells Angels' most important partners. But through all of it, Steinert protected his man. Whatever Magnuson broke, Steinert shielded him from the consequences. So by the fall of 1997, the two men living behind the cameras and the 8-foot fence on Îlot Pruche had managed to enrage almost everyone who mattered. They had angered the nomads, embarrassed the national expansion, crossed the mafia, drawn suspicion of being informers, and built a private crew aimed at the club's own elite. The fence was pointed the wrong way. In October 1997, Steinert got married in the full sense, the celebration and the honeymoon. According to one informer, he had only just returned from that honeymoon when the call came. A meeting at the bunker in Sorel. Sorel was sacred ground, the home of the founding chapter, the mother church of the Canadian Hells Angels. But it was also a building with a dark history. 12 years earlier, in March 1985, that same chapter had summoned the members of its own Laval chapter to a meeting and killed 5 of them, wrapping the bodies in sleeping bags and dumping them in the St. Lawrence. The Lennoxville Massacre. Every member of the club knew exactly what an unexpected summons to a clubhouse could mean. Maybe that is why Donald Magnuson, a man who had killed with his bare hands, left his house that evening in tears. The two men arrived at the bunker on the evening of November 4th, 1997. Inside, the others were waiting. There was no shooting. According to the Hells Angel turned informer Sylvain Boulanger, the meeting was a setup. The members fell on Steinert and Magnuson and beat them to death with a hammer, blow after blow to the skull. When it was over, the bodies were wrapped in plastic, bound with duct tape, driven downriver, and dropped into the St. Lawrence Seaway near Quebec City. The most feared enforcer of the biker war, the executioner himself, was beaten to death by his own club, in the club's own house, with a workshop tool. And then the strangest chapter of the story began. No one outside that bunker knew what had happened, and the police would spend more than a year searching for a man who was already at the bottom of the river. When Scott Steinert vanished, investigators had no idea he was already dead, so they reached the only conclusion that made sense to them, the deportation case. They believed the American had finally run, gone underground to escape being removed from Canada. On January 22, 1998, the Sûreté du Québec issued a warrant for his arrest. Prosecutors charged the missing man with possessing the proceeds of crime, and the state moved on his empire, seizing the Lavigueur estate, 2 houses in Sorel, and a garage. the famous lottery mansion, which had passed from Quebec's luckiest family to its most feared biker, now belonged to the government. For months, Scott Steinert was officially a fugitive, his name on watch lists and his file open, while the river kept his secret. The river gave it up in pieces. On May 23, 1998, Donald Magnuson's bound, decomposed body surfaced in the St. Lawrence Seaway. And on April 15, 1999, almost a year and a half after the fake meeting, Scott Steinert floated up near Saint Nicolas, a few kilometers from a Hells Angels clubhouse outside Quebec City, his body bound and mutilated, and the duct tape still holding. The fugitive case quietly became a homicide file, and the homicide file went nowhere. It took until 2007, when the former Hells Angel Sylvain Boulanger became an informant, for the police to even learn what had happened inside the bunker that night. No one has ever been charged with either murder, and the motive has never been officially resolved, which leaves the story with a question the police themselves never closed. There are at least 4 explanations, and the unsettling part is that every one of them is plausible. He may have died because the club believed he was the informer, which would mean the Hells Angels executed the wrong man while the real traitor kept reporting. He may have died for his ambition, because the group of 5 in the Ontario play made him an intolerable threat to Stadnik and Carroll. He may have died for Magnuson's sins, the killing of David Boyko that wrecked the Manitoba expansion, and the beating of a Rizzuto's son that endangered the club's alliance with the Mafia. Debts Steinert kept refusing to pay on his bodyguard's behalf. Or he may have died for August 9, 1995, the bomb that killed a child, created the Wolverine Squad, and turned the full weight of the state against everyone wearing the patch. The informer who explained the murders could describe how they happened. Even inside the club, the why stayed buried. What is certain is what came after. Normand Biff Hamel, another of Boucher's closest men, inherited the Death Riders, and in April 2000, he was shot to death in a parking lot in front of his own family, another name on the war's ledger. The war consumed its architects one by one. Mom Boucher was convicted of ordering murders and died in prison. Stadnik was swept up in the mass arrests of 2001 and convicted. Wolf Carroll fled the country ahead of the police and has been a fugitive ever since. And Danny Kane, the real informer, the man whose secret may have gotten Steinert killed, kept working for the police until his own death, and the files he left behind helped destroy the entire Nomads chapter. The hunt for the rat had been real. The club had simply never once looked at the right man. Scott Steinert spent his life proving he would do anything to be a Hells Angel, and the club he killed for beat him to death in its own house and let the police chase his ghost. The most dangerous man in the Hells Angels never saw the most dangerous room in Quebec for what it was. But this was not the first time that Bunker's brotherhood ended with bodies in the St. Lawrence. 12 years earlier, the same chapter summoned 5 of its own to a meeting they never walked out of, the night it created the deadliest hitman in Canadian history and then turned on him. Click the next video for that story.